We dream of exploring the unknown, discovering what lies beyond.
The entire initiative is at risk. None of the Golden Worlds panned out. They're a bust. We need to find more resources, but that takes people, and we can't wake them up. Now more than ever, we need a Pathfinder.
Storytelling in video games has come a long way since the days of text adventures and top-down role-playing games like The Legend of Zelda. These days, AAA games have become cinematic experiences, sending us into worlds hopefully filled with memorable characters, gorgeous landscapes, and immersive stories, but how do you tell a good story? The Mass Effect series has always been great at providing real storytelling. Mass Effect was conceived as the first major narrative-driven RPG for the Xbox 360. Some view the Mass Effect games as art, others as a good space opera, and a few as the pinnacle of video game storytelling. But are they good games? The Mass Effect series has had its fair share of criticisms thrown at it, especially with Andromeda. It's not a bad franchise, but it's not perfect either. It's both great and terrible. So join me on a spacefaring trip through the world of Mass Effect. Mass Effect began its development during 2004, headed by the same team behind Knights of the Old Republic. The idea was to create an RPG that emphasized player choice. Many concepts were thrown around, but eventually the developers settled with a one-of-a-kind science fiction universe. All sorts of aliens, large spaceships, planets with varied climates, and a story that took players between different galaxies. Mass Effect's greatest achievement, however, was the main character of Shepard itself. Shepard gave players an unbelievable amount of creativity in an age where involved character creators were not very common. Not only could you choose a male or female body with a fully fledged voice acting component, but you could also change factors like face density, hair color, and nose size. Of course, this resulted in plenty of hideous Shepards being created, but jokes aside, this was customization that not even the Elder Scrolls games had at the time. Shepard was also unique in the fact that you were given multiple dialogue options of responding during conversations. Do you want to act like a gentleman in front of the council? You could do just that. You want to punch the obnoxious reporter in the face? Well, then you are also welcome to do so. But the game wasn't without its flaws now, of course. The autosave feature was very inconsistent, meaning that you would often have to rely on manual saves. Combat lacked any form of melee, forcing you to always keep your distance. And most of the planets outside the main storyline were reskins of the same model, making it aesthetically boring. Nonetheless, Mass Effect 1 was a great platform to launch the series from. The story of having to track down the rogue Spectre Saren was intense, the team members were awesome, and the gameplay fun because it was fairly new at the time. ME1 was a great game for those who got a chance to play it.
No one wants to admit it, but humanity is under attack. One very specific man might be all that stands between humanity and the greatest threat of our brief existence.
Shepard!
Mass Effect 2 had one of the greatest openers to any game I've ever played. It threw you into the action as the Normandy is attacked in this really awesome galactic cinematic. People were dying, the ship is getting torn to pieces, and it's going down. But then, silence. This amazing on-rails portion as you step out into the cold space with the wind howling felt so real. Shepard's deep breathing trembling against his suit as a giant planet looms overhead, foreshadowing the fate of the Normandy and its crew. Games have a hard time of grasping this concept of quietness. Mass Effect 2 really nailed it here. After this opener, my expectations for the rest of the game were pretty damn high, but the game did succeed in nearly every department. The graphics were amazing, the story was epic, yet personal, and I really felt an attachment to the characters because they were all developed so well. It was one of those rare sequels that was as good or better than the original game. But it did feel more detached than existing as a true sequel. This may have been due to the fact that it was developed by Bioware during and after its acquisition by EA in 2007. The first sign of this disconnect comes after the opening. Shepard is killed only to be reborn by Cerberus 2 years later. This rebirth of Shepard leads to a couple things. 1, your team is changed up, and 2, the storyline shifts towards a race called the Collectors, who are working to create a human Reaper, a concept that is only teased throughout the remainder of the game. As a sequel, ME2 also simplified the mechanics. Gone are the RPG staples of an inventory, as well as being able to outfit your squad with different armors and weapons. And goodbye M35 Mako. Now these simplifications were probably used by EA to appeal to more players, but to me, none of that mattered because the game was so impressive overall. Gunfighting was so much better, your teammates were actually fleshed out with their own loyalty contracts, side missions were set on some amazing locations, and the story DLC was fair and plentiful. But one of Mass Effect 2's bigger legacies was an indication that choices would not carry over from game to game, something that the next game would trip up on even more. But all in all, Mass Effect 2 is one of the greatest games of all time and easily my favorite of the series. Mass Effect 3 is a game that everyone had heard about solely because of its endings. Amidst a plethora of broken promises, players were hoping for multiple finales depending on how they played the previous entries, much like Heavy Rain had done 2 years earlier. Sadly, Bioware ignored this, instead giving 4 definitive endings regardless of how you played through the game. It was a shock. This isn't how player choice was supposed to pan out in the Mass Effect series. Bioware also locked an important mission behind Day 1 DLC, which took everyone by surprise, including myself. But so did the game. I personally feel that Mass Effect 3 is the weakest game of the series. It felt just a little bit too linear and a little bit too on-railsy. Just a bit too streamlined, although it was thematically appropriate given the urgency of the war effort centering the game. This war with the Reapers was an effort to bring Mass Effect into the military sci-fi genre that Mass Effect 2 had hinted at. Shepard was taken to different parts of the cosmos as he worked to unite every species against this threat, giving us some awesome set pieces in the process. So in this capacity, Mass Effect 3 was pretty damn epic. To align the gameplay with the narrative, combat pacing was accelerated with new abilities, faster animations, and hand-to-hand fighting. The HUD was also made more user-friendly and practical as well, and almost every supporting character from the franchise was given a proper goodbye. But Mass Effect 3 did not provide a good ending for the Shepard trilogy, so as a standalone entry it was a fairly okay experience, however ultimately overshadowed by earlier titles in the franchise. Many fans were disappointed with Andromeda, but I think if you stuck it out to the end, Andromeda was a fairly decent game. Sure, the scary facial animations gave me nightmares and a few sleepless nights, and the game was full of bugs and issues, but after a few updates the game became a much more enjoyable experience. Now does that excuse the state it was launched in? Definitely not, but there is an okay game underneath all of these issues. What is not okay is how the game approaches character interaction and development. Almost right out of the gates you are flung into some very hard-hitting conversations and relationships with characters you just met. The game forces a lot of these very heavy moments on you without any build-up, which makes much of the early dialogue pretty lifeless. Good character development is supposed to make you care, it takes time. Other story-driven games like Uncharted, The Last of Us, or any other previous Mass Effect game do it right because they know players need to be taught to care. It's not ironic that this is how Andromeda begins, because most of the characters in the game are fairly underdeveloped and their stories disjointed in the end. Although Andromeda's combat and world design were much improved, there are a host of other small issues that seem to be overlooked, but they still add up. The inventory system was still a disaster, the menus were a nightmare, and navigating the galaxy map was slower than watching paint dry, although in concept, it was beautifully designed. Mass Effect Andromeda had a very troubled development that spanned 5 years, full of challenges and repeat changes to its development. Too many hands were touching it, and it ended up being stitched together in the last 18 months of its development. It's true, Andromeda was rushed to meet its deadline. But Andromeda did make good on the promises to provide a sense of discovery that was missing from Mass Effect 3 and 2 to some extent. Zipping around the galaxy as a Pathfinder was actually a really good experience for me because there was a lot of unknown to the world of Andromeda. Problems aside, Andromeda was still a decent game, however one that will be forever debated upon when discussing the Mass Effect franchise. The aftermath of Andromeda's controversial launch has left a lot of questions unanswered. Bioware Montreal has been downsized, and Mass Effect will be put on hold for the time being. So will we see Mass Effect again? Thanks for watching, guys. If you like this type of video, please consider subscribing to Downward Thrust and checking out my Patreon if you'd like to support the things that I do on this channel. But before you go, please share your Mass Effect experiences with us down below and thumbs this video up if you enjoyed it. Have a great day, guys. We'll see you in our next video.